Am I the only one who didn't know Imam Bukhari dedicated his life to collecting authentic hadith? His work changed Islamic history forever. Born in 810, Imam Bukhari traveled thousands of miles, verifying over 600,000 sayings. He compiled Sahih al-Bukhari, a gold standard for hadith authenticity. His dedication shaped how millions understand faith today. Now that's a legacy. Imam Bukhari, the author of the most authentic book after the Quran and the greatest scholar of ahadith. Introduction. His name was Muhammad, his kunyat Abu Abdullah, and the title given to him was Imam al-Muhaddithin. Imam Bukhari was of Zoroastrian descent, and his forefathers were fire worshippers. His great-grandfather Mughira accepted Islam at the hands of the ruler of Bukhara, soon after which he settled in Bukhara, current Uzbekistan. Imam Bukhari's father, Ismail, was a great scholar of hadith, and he had the fortune of learning from luminaries like Imam Malik and Abdullah bin Mubarak. Birth. Muhammad bin Ismail was born on 31 Shawwal on a Friday in 194 Hijri, 809 AD, in the city of Bukhara. Childhood events. The childhood period of Imam Bukhari cannot be ascertained with authenticity. However, we do know that his parents gave him an excellent environment. His father was not only a qualified scholar of hadith, but also a very cultured and pious man. He was a gardener by profession. He passed away when his son Muhammad, Imam Bukhari, was still a young boy. On his deathbed, he stated with conviction that all his wealth had come from legitimate sources. Imam Bukhari went through another tribulation soon after his father passed away. His eyesight weakened to such an extent that he could hardly see anymore. His mother sought help from medical professionals, but there was no improvement in his eyesight. She bowed down before Allah and implored His mercy for her little child. Her heartfelt prayers bore fruit, and one night she saw the Prophet Ibrahim, a.s., in her dream. He gave her the good news of the restoration of her son's eyesight as a result of her endless prayers to Allah. The next morning her son could see perfectly well, and he never experienced the same problem again. The mother showed her gratefulness to Allah by engaging her son in religious pursuits, education, and passion for ahadith. As a child, Muhammad had been gifted with extraordinary intelligence. He completed the memorization of the Quran before the age of 10. Then he developed an interest in the knowledge of hadith. He himself states that Allah gave him the passion to memorize ahadith when he was still in school. At the tender age of 11, he had acquired so much knowledge of ahadith that one day he pointed out a mistake of the celebrated scholar of hadith, Allama Dakhili. The latter was relating the chains of narration of a particular hadith, and he expounded, Sufyan heard from Abu Zubair, who heard from Ibrahim. The young Muhammad interrupted, "O teacher, Abu Zubair never heard from Ibrahim." When Allama saw that the objection was being raised by a mere lad, he did not think much of it and scolded the youth for interrupting his class. The adolescent Muhammad was not one to be subdued easily, so he again commented politely, "O teacher, please consult your original book." Allama Dakhili stood up and went inside to review his work in his primary manuscript. When he returned, he addressed Muhammad and asked him for the correct chain of narration. Muhammad Bukhari stated that Sufyan had heard from Zubair and not Abu Zubair. He also added that Zubair was the son of Adi. At this, Allama Dakhili, the eminent scholar, picked up his pen and corrected his mistake. Imam Bukhari's passion for ahadith guided him to many great scholars and experts of ahadith living in his time. Some distinguished names were Muhammad bin Salam, Abdullah bin Masnadi, and Ibrahim bin Ashas. The depth of his knowledge often stunned his teachers. Allama Salim bin Mujahid relates that once he had gone to visit the renowned scholar of hadith Muhammad bin Salam by Kandi. The latter told him that if he had come earlier, he would have met a boy who knew 70,000 ahadith by heart. The writer was amazed and went out to look for the boy. When he met Imam Bukhari, he asked him to validate the claim that he actually remembered such a vast number of ahadith. Imam Bukhari amazed him with the answer, "Yes, without doubt I remember these ahadith even more. And not only do I know the ahadith, but if you question me regarding their narrators, their cities of residence and their major life events, I can recount even those." It was for this reason that his teacher Muhammad bin Salam Baikandi used to exercise extreme caution during the sessions when Imam Bukhari would step into his class, lest he made an error in front of him. This was the level of Imam Bukhari's scholarship when he was merely 16 years old. Traveling for the attainment of knowledge. Scholars of religious pursuits have traditionally undertaken journeys to far-flung areas to widen their horizons and gain different perspectives from different experts. Islamic scholars have typically undergone tiring journeys under stringent conditions in order to fulfill their thirst for knowledge. Imam Bukhari too decided to embark on a journey in 210 Hijri to follow in the footsteps of his predecessors. He states that when he had memorized the works of Abdullah bin Mubarak and Waqi, he decided to travel to Hijaz. He was 16 years old. After performing Hajj with his mother and brother, he stayed back to continue his education while his family returned back. He attended all the study circles established in Makkah and broadened his horizons. Before attaining the age of 18 years, he had authored a book called The Rulings of the Companions and the Tabi'een, which spoke of the remarkable qualities of the Prophet's companions and the decisions taken by them. Then he proceeded to Medina. He sat beside the grave of the Prophet, saw, and wrote the book Tariq-e-Kabir. This work was mostly accomplished at night in moonlight. Imam Bukhari's travels continued in order to gain further enlightenment and knowledge of ahadith. He states, "I undertook journeys to Syria and Egypt twice. I went to Basra 4 times and Hijaz 6 times. I also accompanied the scholars of hadith to Kufa and Baghdad countless times." Besides this, he traveled as far as Khorasan, Ray, Marv, Balkh, and Herat. Hence, he gained knowledge of ahadith from various experts by touring the length and breadth of the Islamic Empire. Once, someone overheard him say, "I have learnt ahadith from more than 1,000 teachers, and I never memorized a hadith without confirming its authenticity." His amazing power of retention. From childhood onwards, the teachers of Muhammad Bukhari expected a lot from him because of his extraordinary memory, intelligence, and hard work. Hashid bin Ismail, a companion of Imam Bukhari, relates that the Imam would travel with them to different schools in Basra but would never pen down anything. A few days later, his friends asked him not to waste his time like that. On further insistence, Muhammad Bukhari exclaimed that they were going too far in their persistence. He asked them to recite what they had written. The other students took out their scrolls and read from their notes. When they had finished, the Imam related many other ahadith, which they had omitted to write in addition to what they had penned down. The companions of Imam Bukhari even corrected their mistakes through his discourse. It is said that Imam Bukhari wrote down all the ahadith he had learnt in Makkah, in the city of Bukhara. Baghdad was the center of Islamic scholarship, and had more than 800 scholars of ahadith. When the news of Muhammad Bukhari's phenomenal memory reached Baghdad, the scholars there decided to test him. They decided on a unique method of appraisal. The plan was to pick out 100 ahadith and muddle up their chains of narration. These were handed over to 10 experts who presented the ahadith to Imam Bukhari in their incorrect forms. The citizens of Baghdad crowded in to see this unique spectacle. The first man read out the 10 ahadith assigned to him, and to each, Muhammad Bukhari replied, "I don't know of this." In this manner, all 10 men put across their ahadith, and again, the answer that the Imam gave was, "I don't know of this." Imam Bukhari refused to acknowledge any of these ahadith. Then the Imam stood up and addressed the first man. First, he related the 10 ahadith in the incorrect form exactly as the reciter had narrated. Then he recited them correctly with the original chain of narrators. He carried out a similar exercise with all 10 gentlemen who had been placed there to test his astounding memory. One by one, he would address them, first apprising them of the fallacious ahadith and then correcting them. The amazing thing to note was that the Imam had heard the mixed-up versions of the ahadith only once, and he remembered the order perfectly. This incident dumbfounded the people of Baghdad and left a lasting impression on their minds. A similar incident occurred in Samarkand, where the scholars of ahadith decided to test the knowledge and retention of Imam Bukhari. They jumbled up the chains of narration of ahadith from Syria, Iraq, Hijaz, and Yemen. This hodgepodge of tampered narrations was presented before Muhammad Bukhari, who did not fail to correct even one hadith and paired the right text with the right succession of narrators. It was said of the Imam that when he glanced through a book, he would know it by heart. Imam Bukhari had not only memorized thousands of ahadith by heart, but he was also an expert in the science of ahadith. It is extremely difficult and tedious to understand the reasoning and hidden nuances behind the ahadith. Not every scholar of ahadith has this competence, which requires memory, understanding, and vast knowledge of the science of hadith. These hidden shades can play a significant role in the acceptance or rejection of a hadith. The scholar of hadith needs to know the years of birth and death of the narrators, their occupations, historical incidents, their teachers, their places of residence, the periods of their interaction with various teachers, etc. They have to study the variations of the same hadith through different chains of narrators, the actual text as conveyed by each narrator, and an overall comprehension of the entire collection of ahadith. That Imam Bukhari was an authority in ahadith and its related disciplines can be judged by the fact that Imam Muslim would visit him as a student to gain more insight into the various sciences of ahadith. Imam Tirmizi has presented a comprehensive discourse on the authenticity of ahadith in his book, The Tirmizi Compilation. He states, "In this book, the majority of the reasoning and nuances of ahadith, the historical facts and the commentary on the narrators of ahadith have been obtained from the books of Imam Bukhari. In addition, most of the bases of ahadith were personally taken down firsthand during his lectures." History of compilation of ahadith and the fabrication of ahadith. It would be appropriate to delve into an account of the earliest collections of ahadith before we go into details of the eternally beneficial work of Imam Bukhari, the Sahih Bukhari. We all acknowledge the fact that the companions of the Prophet had the deepest regard and love for him. They would rush to carry out his slightest command and would emulate his every action. During the early years of prophethood, the companions made an attempt to write down some of his sayings, but the Prophet did not give his approval. He might have been apprehensive that the words of the Quran and ahadith would get mixed up. Hence we find the Prophet's instructions to this effect in Sahih Muslim: "If anyone has written down the words I utter besides the Quran, he should erase them." The beginning of compilation of ahadith during the life of the Prophet in the later years at Medina, when the companions were sufficiently groomed, and there was no fear of the Quran and Hadith getting intermingled, the Prophet not only allowed the companions to pen down the ahadith, but also encouraged it. In this regard, he supported their effort by adding, "May Allah keep fresh and happy the person who listened to my words and then saved them. Then he conveyed them to the one who had not heard them." At the same time, the Prophet asked his companions to exercise utmost caution in recording the ahadith. He stated, "Hell is the abode of the one who attributed something to me which I did not utter." He further added that the person to whom a query regarding religion is directed and who hides the piece of knowledge regarding it, of which he is aware, will be strapped to a rain of fire in hell. In the light of all these statements, the companions became extremely vigilant in matters of reporting and recording a hadith. If they were questioned regarding an issue and were aware of any ruling of the Prophet concerning it, they would not hesitate to share the information. But the documentation of a hadith was not very common during the lifetime of the Prophet, for the simple reason that he present himself. Whenever a new problem occurred, it was referred to him. Also, the Arabs had a startling memory, and they thought it beneath their dignity to write down something when they could remember it so well. It is fascinating that they could relate the genealogy of their horses. Most of the Arabs were illiterate. In spite of this, we find occasions during the Prophet's time when ahadith were documented. Tirmidhi relates an incident which seems to belong to a period marking the start of the documentation of ahadith. A man came to the Prophet, and said, "What you say is extremely important, but my memory is weak and I often forget, so what should I do?" The Prophet, advised that he should make use of his right hand, meaning he should write them down. Later, Abdullah bin Amr bin As, a young 17-year-old companion of the Prophet who had exceptional intelligence and possessed a keen desire to seek knowledge, decided to take advantage of this permission and began to record everything the Prophet articulated. Some people disapproved of this act and remarked that the Prophet was only human. Sometimes he could be angry and it may not be correct to write what he says during this condition. Abdullah bin Amr, mentioned these comments to the Prophet, who answered, "By the one to whom my life belongs, nothing escapes from my lips but the truth, so continue to write." According to certain traditions, Abdullah bin Amr bin As organized a collection of ahadith called the Truthful Collection. It contained about 10,000 ahadith. Similarly, Anas, who was a special servant of the Prophet, and spent 9 years in his company, compiled a number of ahadith and even got them verified by the Prophet, by reading it out to him. Likewise, another collection of ahadith is attributed to Ali bin Abi Talib, who guarded it zealously after the death of the Prophet, and would often quote from it on occasions. These were the personal efforts of the companions. The formal letters, pacts, orders, and other communications of the Prophet, were preserved and can be found in various museums all over the Muslim world. The companions' endeavors after the Prophet's death. After the Prophet, passed away, many of his companions made attempts to record his sayings. If they had not endeavored to do this, this important heritage would have dwindled away, and we would have lost a whole treasure of religious knowledge and application. Hence, Samra bin Jundub, Abdullah bin Masud, Sa'd bin Ubadah, Abdullah bin Abbas, and Abu Huraira, all worked on compilations of ahadith. The Prophet's eminent companion, Abu Bakr Siddiq, also prepared a collection of 1,500 ahadith after the death of the Prophet, He handed it over to Aisha, his daughter, for safekeeping. The following night he could not sleep a wink and went to see Aisha, in the morning, requesting her to hand him back the compilation. He was apprehensive that he might have attributed something to the Prophet that he did not utter. When she brought out the document, he erased it with water. Likewise, Umar bin Khattab, also decided to record ahadith of the Prophet, but he was held back by the thought that people might start ignoring the Quran in favor of ahadith. Both these renowned companions were extremely cautious in the matter of ahadith because to them it was no ordinary matter. In all matters individual and collective, they referred to the ahadith as the next authentic source of knowledge after the Quran. In the time of his caliphate, if someone presented a new hadith which was unknown to Umar, the caliph would seek witnesses to verify and support it. Abdullah bin Masud, was a frequent visitor to the Prophet's house. He would tremble with trepidation whenever he would utter the words, "And the Prophet said," then he would add, something like this, and other words to this effect so that he would not be held accountable for any small error on his part. Some of the companions of the Prophet abandoned the practice of relating and recording ahadith in their old age for fear of making a mistake due to weak memory. Only an ignorant person would deduce that the companions of the Prophet were negligent in recording a hadith, or that they could have made mistakes because of heedlessness. The companions not only understood and remembered the sayings of the Prophet, but also recalled his actions and comprehended his body language. Once a man asked Kebab, R.A., if the Prophet, would recite the Quran in the afternoon prayers. Kebab answered in the affirmative. When people asked him how he knew this, he replied that he figured out from the movement of the Prophet's beard that he was reciting. It must be mentioned that in congregational afternoon prayers of Zuhr and Asr, the recitation by the Imam is silent, while in the remaining 3 prayers it is loud. Likewise, Abdullah, R.A., while explaining the process of prayer, stated that he could see the movement of the Prophet's fingers during the prayer. The companions of the Prophet settled in various conquered territories of the Muslim Empire in order to propagate the teachings of Islam. Abu Darda Kolani states that when he entered a mosque in Homs, he glimpsed a group of 32 companions whom he joined. One of the companions would end his sermon, and the other would start in order to educate the new converts. Similarly, Huzaifa bin Yaman, R.A., would teach in the city of Kufa, and Abu Darda, R.A., would disseminate religious knowledge in Damascus. Both had huge followings. Jabir bin Abdullah, R.A., would lecture in the Mosque of the Prophet, in Medina. Abu Zar Ghafari, R.A., declared that if a sword was placed on his neck, and he knew that he could utter one more word that he had learnt from the Prophet, he would articulate that word before the sword finished him off. The famous companion of the Prophet Abu Hurairah, R.A., was much sought after for the learning of ahadith, as he related the highest number of ahadith. He was typically surrounded by students in great multitudes. When Abu Sa'id Khudri, R.A., would start relating ahadith, he would be crowded by eager pupils. A large number of students, both men and women, benefited from the vast fountain of religious knowledge of Aisha, R.A., the mother of the believers. During the lifetime of the companions of the Prophet, they sincerely and wholeheartedly dispensed and propagated the true religion as they had learnt from the Prophet, directly. Thus it can be concluded that the companions of the Prophet did whatever was humanly possible to preserve and record the sayings and the actions of the Messenger of Allah. There is no logical reason to doubt the authenticity of a hadith after looking at their efforts to preserve, memorize, and reproduce the words of the Prophet, During the era of the companions, the recording of ahadith took place at a large scale. Many eminent companions had their own collections of ahadith. However, they were very cautious in this regard. Memorizing a hadith by heart was more common, the fabrication of a hadith. If matters had stopped here, the history of a hadith would have indeed been short. After the death of the second Caliph Umar, R.A., certain shady and hostile elements reared their ugly head during the caliphate of Usman, R.A. Their leader was Ibn Saba, who was of Jewish descent and had reverted to Islam. He originated from Yemen. His mind was constantly devising devious schemes in order to create dissension in the Muslim society. He had gathered around him a number of hypocrites who were insincere Muslims, and together they targeted the characters of the companions of the Prophet, Ibn Saba recognized the fact that the compilation of the Quran had taken place, and all the Muslims were in agreement on this issue, so the seeds of doubt could not be planted regarding the words of the Quran. Hence he aimed at tarnishing the image of the companions' persona in the minds of the Muslims. He presented some of them as superior and accused and insulted others. He tried to pitch them against each other. He accused eminent companions of the Prophet like Abu Bakr and Umar of working against the directives of the Prophet, S.A. He further blamed other companions for joining hands with the former. His misleading arguments were heard by a lot of people in different cities that Ibn Saba visited one after the other. He was expelled from each metropolis after poisoning the masses with his deceptive talk. After being driven out from Basra and Kufa, he entered Egypt. The distressing fact is that he left a trail of miscreants in each city that he departed from. The majority of these dissidents were Bedouin Arabs who settled in the newly conquered territories of the Muslim Empire. After the death of many companions of the Prophet, their native treacherous nature was rising to the surface again. The ones who fell prey to this slanderous talk were mostly from these ignorant and weak-charactered tribes. They became suspicious about the pure intentions of the companions and began to stir the masses against them. The average Arab person was simple, yet knew the difference between truth and falsehood. Hence, to lend veracity to their accusations, they initiated the process of fabrication of ahadith. On the political front, Usman, R.A., was a lenient and soft-hearted caliph. Taking advantage of his clemency, the miscreants raised up a storm of dissension among the masses. The caliph was housebound and then murdered, and the fabricators of ahadith intermingled with the army of Ali, R.A., the new caliph, so well that they could not be identified. These mischief-mongers would ascribe to the Prophet Esau as they saw fit. Such transgression was bound to be noticed, and Ali came to know what Ibn Saba and his supporters were up to. The caliph announced that such malefactors would be whipped as punishment. Then he called Ibn Saba and reprimanded him for his evil designs. He publicly denied the pronouncement that he had been granted access to special knowledge by the Prophet Sa, as claimed by Ibn Saba. When he did not get dissuaded from his malevolent plans, Ali, R.A., stated on his face that Ibn Saba was one of the 30 Dajjals who the Muslims had been warned about in a hadith. Ultimately, Ibn Saba was banished from Kufa. Hafiz ibn Hajar writes that Ali, R.A., burnt these troublemakers during his caliphate. Unfortunately, the poison injected by these fabricators of ahadith had penetrated deep within the Muslim empire. The majority of the masses started using these invented ahadith with ease and confidence, as though they were really the words of the Prophet, Sa, as related by his companions. Many of the righteous started ignoring the importance of ahadith because the authentic could not be easily separated from the fabricated. People became confused and became so cautious in quoting or listening to ahadith that they preferred to stay away from them and considered the Quran to be sufficient. This was an appalling state of affairs. In the wake of false ahadith, the real sunnah of the Prophet, Sa, was significantly declining in importance. After dealing with the mischief makers, Ali, R.A., felt a profound need to reinstate the worth of ahadith. He stated that a man should pay the utmost attention to a hadith because it was a source of true direction and the best piece of guidance, guaranteeing righteousness and piety. The next step that he took was to present a clear picture of the sayings of the Prophet, Sa, to deal with this intolerable situation. He tried to separate truth from falsehood. Once Ali announced at the pulpit, "Who will purchase a treasure of knowledge from me at a mere cost of 1 dirham?" Then he would dictate a hadith while others would write. Ali would catch hold of people and would insist that they ask him regarding religious matters so that he could clarify truth from falsehood. Those who maligned the reputations of the noble companions of the Prophet were severely criticized by Ali, R.A. He berated them and beseeched Allah to destroy these elements who had defiled the high status of companions and distorted the words of the Prophet, Sa. To dilute the impact of these negative forces, he would advise the people to stick to those matters in religion which were clear to them and to stay away from dubious statements attributed to the Prophet, Sa. The role of various factions in distortion of ahadith, Ali, Ibn Abbas, and other eminent companions of the Prophet were constantly involved in the separation of truth from falsehood. Amid their untiring efforts, an unfortunate event occurred. Ali was assassinated and martyred by a miscreant while summoning the Muslims for Fajr prayers. Now the field was clear for the troublemakers who identified the simplest and weak-minded of Ali's supporters in order to inundate them with false ahadith regarding the stature of Ali. They also made up ahadith and attributed them to Ali, R.A., although he had nothing to do with them. The blind followers of Ali started believing these ahadith and accorded to them a status close to revelation. At this juncture, the next generation of dedicated scholars, the Tabi'in, stepped up to clarify the status and importance of ahadith. But the matter had spun out of control. Now it was not just the Saba'ites, followers of Ibn Saba, who were fabricating and distorting ahadith. They were joined in this heinous activity by sycophants, storytellers, rawafis, staunch supporters of Ali, Kharijites, hence anyone and everyone who had an ulterior motive stepped in to warp the wordings uttered by the Messenger of Allah. The faction of Zanadaka concocted 14,000 ahadith. Fortunately, the masses were forewarned of their wicked tendencies, hence they were not attracted to this group. Some storytellers formulated interesting tales interwoven with fabricated ahadith in order to gain popularity among the Muslim masses. They were nominated to speak at the mosques instead of religious scholars. People were attracted to these storytellers because they concocted fascinating stories. A scholar of Hadith, Ibn Aun, relates that hardly a handful of students could be found listening to eminent scholars in Kufa, while the masses thronged to listen to these storytellers in great multitudes. During the Umayyad dynasty, several formulators of ahadith rose to prominence. They would not hesitate to distort the words of the Prophet, in order to please the ruling party or the sultans. This practice continued for a while. We find an incident where Ghiyas bin Ibrahim entered into the court of Caliph Mehdi, where a tamed pigeon was entertaining the caliph. Ghiyas was asked to relate a hadith of the Prophet, He at once made up a hadith that Rasul Allah, had said that competition was permissible only in partridges, horses, camels, and birds. After Ghiyas left the royal palace, Caliph Mehdi told those present that he was quite sure that the former had fabricated this hadith just to please him. He then proceeded to slaughter the pigeon. Similarly, some foolish people who had gained religious knowledge concocted a hadith to place fear in people's heart. When they were questioned for their act, they merely replied that fear would make the masses more pious and increase them in devotion. In this regard, Ibn Jawzi, a scholar of ahadith, quotes an incident. Once Imam Ahmed bin Hanbal and Yahya bin Mu'in stopped by a mosque for prayers. After the prayer was over, a preacher stood up to deliver a hadith. He quoted Ahmed bin Hanbal and Yahya bin Mu'in and claimed to have heard the hadith from them, who heard from Adbur Razak, who heard from Muammar, who heard from Qatada, who heard from Anas, R.A. According to the hadith, the Prophet said that whoever says La ilaha illallah, Allah creates for him a bird for every letter that he utters. The beak of the bird is made of gold and its wings are made of pearls. The preacher continued to exaggerate on this topic at great length. Imam Ahmed bin Hanbal and Yahya bin Mu'in, who were present in the audience, looked at each other in astonishment. They confirmed that neither had heard of this hadith attributed to them. They called the preacher, and he came over readily, thinking that he would be rewarded with a gift. Yahya asked him who had related this hadith to him. He again took their names. When they identified themselves as Ahmed and Yahya, proclaiming that they had never heard this hadith, the preacher confidently replied that he had heard that Yahya was a foolish person, and today it was proven true. He continued that there could be other Yahyas and Ahmeds besides them, and that he has narrated a hadith from 17 Ahmeds and Yahyas. He left the place mocking at these two, instead of being shameful for his abominable act. Efforts of Tabi'in and Tabi'in in compilation of ahadith. No efforts were spared in the second Hijri for the collection of ahadith by the scholars of Islam. They traveled far and wide from one end of the Islamic Empire to another for this purpose. A concern arose about the authenticity of ahadith and the issue of sifting and grading them. The Tabi'in who had benefited from the company of the companions of the Prophet were gradually leaving the world. The vast conquest of the Muslims had brought in new languages, and the Arabic text, its meaning and idiom were changing, or would often be handled differently by Muslims of various regions. After the demise of the Tabi'in worked in earnest to compile the Ahadith. At the government level, there were individuals like Umar bin Abdul Aziz, who ordered a compilation of Ahadith to be prepared. In Medina, the famous Mawda was written by Imam Malik, Ibn Jarij in Makkah, Imam Awza'i in Syria, Sufyan Suri in Kufa, Hamad bin Salma in Basra were scholars who served and supplemented with their efforts the elementary subject of Ahadith. Now people started to memorize Ahadith in the thousands, and the recording of prophetic sayings became more common. History books are full of accounts of the immense devotion exhibited by the scholars of Ahadith towards their subject. It was not unusual for a scholar to journey for days and travel hundreds of miles just to verify a hadith. The science of Ahadith, the unparalleled achievement of Muslims. The study of Ahadith became a proper science. For a scholar of Hadith, it was crucial to learn the chains of relation and the text of the Ahadith, as well as the biography and character of the narrators of Ahadith. The biography of narrators, Asma ur Rijal, contained the names of countless narrators and would include accounts of their condition, culture, manners, habits, and dealings with others. These narrators were minutely examined and had to pass several criteria before being accepted as genuine. Dr. Springer writes, "No nation has lived on this earth or exists today to produce a work of greater genius than the biography of narrators of Ahadith. Through it we get to learn about the complete life histories of 500,000 personalities." All these efforts in the compilation of genuine Ahadith helped stop the damage done by the fabricators of Ahadith. An example will clarify this point. The Jews of Khaybar presented a document in the Caliph's court and stated that the Prophet had dictated it. According to it, the Jews of Khaybar were exempted from forced labor and jizya, tax levied on non-Muslims in return for the protection offered. The court ministers showed the document to the scholars of Ahadith before arriving at any decision. The scholars rejected the authenticity of this document by stating the following proofs. The document was witnessed by Sa'ad bin Ma'az, who had passed away before the Battle of Khaybar took place. The document was written by Muawiyah bin Abi Sufyan, who had not embraced Islam at the time. Taxes like jizya can be waived for friends of Islam, while the Jews of Khaybar were enemies of Muslims. Forced labor was not practiced during the lifetime of the Prophet, so there was no question of it being waived. Most important of all, the Quranic order of jizya had yet not been revealed. Hence, the fallacious account of the Jews was rejected on the basis of these strong arguments. In those days, many talented and dedicated scholars presented their collections of Ahadith. A few among them were Ahmed bin Hanbal, Usman bin Abi Shayba, and Ishaq bin Rawiyah. Due to their efforts, the Muslim Ummah was blessed with a vast treasure of Ahadith. The scholars of Ahadith went on to establish definitive standards for the acceptance of Ahadith. Also deemed crucial was the life account and character of the narrators. A critical analysis of the text of various Ahadith was also considered. The Muslim Ummah needed to have a sound and tested compilation of Ahadith which could be adhered to without any doubt, a definite treasure of Ahadith which would be pure from weak and fabricated words attributed to the Prophet, a work that could be used by the common man in addition to the scholars. Sahih Bukhari, the most authentic book after the Quran. We have mentioned the emotional attachment and respect that Imam Bukhari had for the words of the Prophet, He was well acquainted with all the existing collections of Ahadith. He could see the different strong and weak traditions present in these compilations. Imam Bukhari would always feel the presence of a gap. One day, when he was in the company of Imam Ishaq bin Rawiyah, the latter expressed a desire that Imam Bukhari should compile a book of authentic Ahadith of the Prophet, from the entire collection of ahadith. Imam Bukhari says that his words left a deep impression on his heart and provided the fuel that fired his imagination. He wasted no time in the start of a new journey towards the collection of authentic ahadith. Later he dreamt that he was fanning the Prophet, and dispersing the flies surrounding him. When he sought the interpretation of his dream, he was told that he would dispel the dark clouds over the Prophet, referring to the lies and fabricated ahadiths. This vision of the messenger further strengthened his resolve to undertake the task of a most authentic collection of ahadith. This task was going to be no ordinary undertaking. The past era had seen a great upsurge in the fabrication of ahadith. A few individuals are credited for making up thousands of ahadith. A man called Abdullah Karim Wada once boasted that he had concocted 4,000 ahadith. In these tough circumstances, Imam Bukhari gathered his courage and determination for this uphill assignment. He would investigate each hadith, and when he was convinced of its authenticity, he would offer the prayer of istikhara, to seek guidance from Allah. Only then he would include the hadith in his book. His passion for his work has been described by Warriq, who happened to be with the Imam when he was writing the chapter on tafsir. He relates that Imam Bukhari would get up 15 to 20 times in the night, light the oil lamp, mark certain ahadith, and then again retire for a little while. The writer urged the Imam to wake him up to light the lamp, but the Imam insisted on doing it himself, since he didn't want to disturb the sleep of the young man. In spite of being cautious to the limit, he would still beseech Allah to grant him the ability to undertake this great endeavor. The Imam states that he had not included any hadith in the book until he had offered 2 rakats of prayer for it. A section of this work was completed in the Masjid-e-Haram. It was completed after 18 years of exhaustive hard work and dedication. When he decided to divide the whole volume into subject-wise chapters, he proceeded to Medina and continued the process in the place between the grave of the Prophet, and his pulpit. Every time he would come to a new subject, he would pray 2 nafils of prayer. When he had sifted through 600,000 ahadith, he presented the final collection to esteemed scholars like Imam Ahmed bin Hanbal, Yahya bin Mu'in, and Ali al-Madani. They expressed deep admiration for the collection of ahadith and appreciated its authenticity. They only investigated about 4 ahadith. The Sahih Bukhari became a prestigious and much sought-after book while Imam Bukhari was alive, and he personally recited it directly to 90,000 students. Sahih Bukhari is credited as the second most authentic book after the Quran. Imam Bukhari also happened to write other books, but unfortunately, they are not available to us today. The uniqueness of Sahih Bukhari. We would like to discuss why Sahih Bukhari is classified as the most authentic book after the Quran. In the Sahih Bukhari, we find ahadith that go back to the Prophet, via only 3 chains of narrators. Such ahadith are called salasiyat. Imam Muhammad Bukhari was the first to undertake the gigantic task of recording only genuine ahadith. For this purpose, he went through 600,000 ahadith and picked out only 4,000 as most reliable. If we include the ahadith repeated through different chains, we still come to a figure of only 7,275. Imam Bukhari paid the utmost attention to the historical accounts of the narrators. He had to separate the bona fide from the insincere, and this was no easy task. He was careful in his choice of words for the narrators. He would never use harsh words in his criticism of reporters of ahadith, like liar or fabricator. Occasionally we do find some narrators being labeled as munkar-i-hadith, deniers of hadith, and that meant that it was not acceptable to relate ahadith from them. He was particular about the character of each reporter of ahadith. Once the Imam traveled far and wide to investigate the state of a hadith. When he reached the concerned narrator, the person was pretending that he had some fodder for his horse so that the animal would come to him. When the horse came closer, he shrugged his shoulders and straightened up. The Imam decided to turn back then and there because a man who could fool his horse could also deceive men. Sahih Bukhari is a unique book recited directly by Imam Bukhari in front of 90,000 students. What an amazing chain of narration it has. Imam Najmuddin, who wrote an explanation of Sahih Bukhari, proudly claims that he can trace 50 links to Imam Bukhari through various teachers. Very few old books besides the Quran can claim to be in a completely authentic and untouched state to this day, and Sahih Bukhari is one of them, to the extent that no doubt has ever been cast on its originality. While Imam Bukhari tried his utmost best to select the most authentic ahadith for his book, he also kept in mind the derivation of fiqh issues from these ahadith. If one hadith provides the answer to multiple issues, the same has been noted under different headings. The Imam would first state the Quranic verses dealing with a particular topic, and then the related ahadith. Thus we see that Sahih Bukhari, besides being an authentic collection of ahadith, is also a source of guidance in issues of fiqh. To be included in the Sahih, a hadith had to pass very stringent conditions. The chain of reporters from top to bottom had to consist of narrators who were by and large acceptable to scholars of ahadith. They had to be Muslim, truthful, reputable, had to possess strong memories, be of sound mind, possess clarity of thought, and hold sound Islamic beliefs. The hadith had to have an unbroken chain of narrators. It had to be accepted by the eminent scholars of the previous generation. The relators of a hadith had to be A-grade. Average or low-grade narrators were not included. The A-grade scholars had a phenomenal memory and sound Islamic beliefs. They had to have spent a considerable length of time attached to each of their sheikhs in order to recognize the ahadith of their teachers easily. These are the qualities that single out Sahih Bukhari from other Islamic literature. To date, dozens of explanations of Sahih Bukhari have been written, and the scholars have left no aspect of it untouched. Some have commented on its linguistic aspect, while others have argued about its narrators. Yet others have tried to summarize it. Today in the Islamic world, we find the Muslims divided into diverse sects. But this book has cut its way into the hearts of Muslims all over the globe and has found universal acceptance because of its authenticity. Whether it is a scholar of ahadith or fiqh, a philosopher or a Sufi saint, all turn to the Sahih for spiritual guidance as they are dependent on the sayings of the Prophet, SAW. Centuries have passed, but this volume seems as popular as ever. The greatest work of Imam Bukhari has influenced and benefited tens of millions of Muslims throughout the ages. What did the Imam think of his masterpiece? He remarked once, "I have created this book as a salvation for my soul." The eminent students Imam Bukhari was blessed with talented and dedicated students who rank among the top scholars of a hadith and whose books were included among the 6 most authentic books of hadith. Imam Muslim, Imam Nisai, and Imam Tirmidhi were all students of Imam Bukhari. Imam Muslim was inspired by Sahih Bukhari when he ventured to create a similar piece of work, Sahih Muslim. It is regarded as the next most authentic book after Sahih Bukhari. Imam Muslim verifies that Imam Muhammad Bukhari was unique in his abilities and endowments. He would call his teacher Sayyidul Muhaddithin, the leader of the hadith scholars. Imam Tirmidhi also mentions that in his work of genius, Jame' Tirmidhi, most of the rationales behind a hadith, the commentary on the narrators and discussion on important issues have been inspired and influenced by Imam Bukhari, most of which he directly imbibed from his great teacher. Besides these famous imams, Imam Darmi and Imam Ibn Khuzaimah also benefited from Imam Bukhari. These were the more well-known students whose names are known and recorded in history. The students of ahadith and others were so eager and anxious to learn from the Imam that they would get hold of the Imam while he would walk down the street and start writing ahadith. Lo and behold, their number would reach thousands. Opposition and trial, Imam Muhammad Bukhari would avoid the company of the governors and the elite, the ruling gentry. He firmly disliked the adulation and flattery meted out to those in command. He would say, "Knowledge is debased in the company of the elite, and their adulation leads to the corruption of religion." After completing the historic Sahih Bukhari, the Imam returned to his native city of Bukhara. These were times when the whole Muslim empire was raving over his immense contribution. To welcome him, the locals had lined the streets for 3 miles outside the city. Rich and poor, elite and common, all wanted to catch a glimpse of the great scholar. After settling down in Bukhara, the Imam started his hadith lectures. Groups of students would flock to his house to benefit from his knowledge. The ruler of Bukhara decided to summon the Imam to teach him. Unfortunately, he did not recognize the value of knowledge. He ordered the Imam to come with his book and recite the ahadith to him. The Imam refused to oblige, stating that he could not debase true knowledge and would not knock on the door of the ruling elite. He further announced that he was not one to hide knowledge. If the governor wanted to learn ahadith, he had to come to the mosque or to the Imam's house. There was no way that he would preach to only the privileged and ignore the underprivileged. The governor of Bukhara was extremely displeased with the Imam's reply. He sent him another request to set aside special timings for the coaching of the princes in religious matters at the Imam's own residence or at the mosque. The Imam answered, "This is the inheritance of the Prophet. All people, whether rich or poor, have equal right to acquire it. The doors of my mosque and school are open to all. Whoever is interested should enter and receive knowledge. No one will be barred from it." This response was received with a heavy heart, and it angered the governor. He decided to get even with Imam Bukhari and started plotting against him. He assigned a few people to accumulate evidence against the Imam in order to malign him. The Imam was accused of issuing incorrect rulings and of holding the erroneous belief that the Quran was the creation of Allah. This wrong notion was publicized, and the Imam was ordered to leave the city of Bukhara. When Imam Bukhari left the city, he cursed those who had placed false blame on him. "O Allah, afflict them with what they intended for me and their offspring." Hardly a month went by when the caliph sent dismissal orders for the governor of Bukhara, who was made to ride out in public on a donkey and was finally imprisoned. The rest of the conspirators also suffered a dreadful fate regarding either their lives, properties, or offspring. Imam Bukhari proceeded to Baikund, but he was not well received in this city. He then received a request from the people of Samarkand, beseeching him to benefit them with his immense knowledge. He accepted their appeal and left for Samarkand. He reached the home of a relative close to the city. After a few days, he fell sick. The natives of Samarkand continued to send messages to the Imam, imploring him to come to them. Imam Bukhari decided to travel further despite his illness, but soon he received the news that the people of Samarkand were also divided. Some supported the Imam, while others were against him. This report saddened the Imam, and he supplicated to Allah in the hours of the night. "O Allah, your earth is wide, but it has become constricted for me. Allow me to return to you." His prayers were answered as usual, and he was soon to leave the world. Death. In this state, another message reached him with the information that the people of Samarkand had united in their stance and were eagerly awaiting him. Imam Bukhari summoned a horse and started his journey onwards. 2 men were needed to support him and walked him towards the mount. He had hardly walked a little when he asked to be released and raised up his hands to pray. Then he lay down and was drenched in sweat. He passed away on the day of Eid, 256 Hijri, at the age of 62 years. The funeral prayers were led for him in Kartang after Zuhr prayers. After he was buried, his grave emitted a strong fragrance, better than musk. This news traveled far and wide, and masses thronged to his grave to witness the phenomenon. They would carry some soil with them. The residents of the place sealed the grave because they were scared that no mud would be left if the situation was left uncontrolled. Personality and character. Imam Muhammad Bukhari had received a sizable inheritance at the death of his father. This was the money about which his father had sworn that it was completely earned through halal means. Imam Bukhari invested this whole amount in trade. This way he continued to focus solely on religious education. The profit gained from this trade was spent on students and scholarly persons. The Imam was cautious not to let the love for money enter his heart. Once a group of traders offered 5,000 dirhams to him for some goods. He promised to let them know the answer the next day. Next morning, another group of merchants offered to pay double for the same amount of goods. The Imam refused on the pretext that he had made the intention the previous night to deal with the first group of traders. He did not like to break his intention. It must be borne in mind that the Imam had not yet made the commitment, but still he did not go for a higher profit. This was actually an act of purification of the heart. He endeavored to keep his heart free of diseases like greed. The Imam was not always in a good financial position. As a student, he saw some tough times. Once while traveling, he ran out of funds and had to survive on grass and leaves for several days. He preferred starving rather than asking others for help. Once in Basra, he ran out of money, so he decided to sell his clothes. When fellow students inquired about his absence from the class, they discovered that he had sold everything he owned but would not reveal his condition out of self-respect. Imam Bukhari was careful to abide by the Sunnah as much as he could. He opened an inn for travelers outside Bukhara. Along with other laborers and masons, he would carry bricks for its construction. A student protested against his hard labor. The Imam replied that this deed would definitely benefit him. He hinted towards the battle of the trench in which the Prophet, himself had helped out in the digging of the trench around Medina. The Imam learnt the skill of archery just because the Prophet, had emphasized its importance. He would go out and practice his shooting of arrows in a ground. This was an unheard of practice for a scholar. Imam Bukhari would exercise caution even in small matters like all great scholars. Once while practicing archery, an arrow hit a bridge and damaged a part of it. He at once proceeded to the bridge to inspect the damage, took his arrow out, and asked his companion to go to the owner of the bridge in order to determine the amount needed to repair or reconstruct it. The owner, himself an admirer of Imam Bukhari, did not want any compensation and commented that it would be an honor to sacrifice all his belongings for the Imam. On hearing this, the Imam was appeased, and he gave 100 dirhams in charity. Imam Muhammad Bukhari would display the same vigilance with the use of his tongue. He himself states, "Since I have found out that backbiting is haram, I have not bad-mouthed anyone, and I am hopeful that no claimant will stand up against me in this regard on the Day of Judgment." It would be worthwhile to mention a little incident here. Once he asked a man called Abu Mashar to forgive him. The man was surprised and asked him the reason for the forgiveness. The Imam replied, "Once I saw you wave your hands and jerk your head in a weird manner out of happiness and excitement, and I laughed at you." Abu Mashar could not believe his ears at the guilt the Imam felt at such a small act, and he prayed that Allah have mercy on him. This extraordinary carefulness was the cause behind his unblemished personality. He recognized his esteemed status as a scholar and propagator of prophetic knowledge and wisdom. He realized that a slip on his part could ruin the work of a lifetime. If the masses started doubting his intentions, this could create misgivings about his work. History tells us an incident regarding this. Imam Bukhari once traveled by boat in pursuit of knowledge. This was at a time when he was aiming to seek higher religious education. The Imam had a bag containing 1,000 gold coins. He revealed this to a fellow traveler who was constantly by his side and serving him. After a few days, this passenger got up from his bed and started to create a furor on board, drawing the attention of other passengers. He was shouting, screaming, and beating his head. On inquiry, he claimed that his bag containing 1,000 gold coins had been stolen. When the people on the boat started to search the passengers one by one, Imam Bukhari quietly slipped the bag of coins into the sea. When he was searched, nothing was found. When he got a chance to be alone with the Imam, the cunning fellow inquired about the money. To his utter amazement, the Imam disclosed that he had thrown it overboard. He asked the Imam why he had wasted such a heavy sum. Imam Bukhari questioned his common sense and told him that he had spent his entire life in the learning and collection of a hadith. People all over the Islamic Empire had confidence and belief in him. If he had been pronounced a thief, his entire effort would have gone down the drain, and all because of a few metal pieces. Imam Bukhari was hard on himself, but tender with others. When his debtors would ask for extension of time, he would readily give them as much time as they needed. People would admonish him on this act, but he would reply, "Do you think you are more of a well-wisher to me than my own self? It is not appropriate to put the debtor into difficulty and anxiety." Compassion and consideration were part of his nature. The Imam would keep his tongue moist with the remembrance of Allah. He once stated that before indulging in any talk of the world, he would always mention the praise of Allah. At the end of the night, he would offer 13 rakats of prayer as a routine. So involved was he in his prayer that once when an insect bit him during his prayer, he did not break his prayer, nor did he quickly finish it, but continued with composure. Then he removed the poisonous bug, although by then his skin showed signs of swelling here and there. People were concerned about him and wanted to know why he had not completed the prayers quickly. The Imam answered that he had been reciting a chapter of the Quran and he wanted to complete it. Imam Bukhari once commented, "Man should be in such a state that if he presents a request before his Creator, it should not be turned down." This statement aptly describes the Imam. His prayers would always be answered. We conclude his character sketch at this remark of the Imam: "Once I presented 2 appeals before my Lord. He fulfilled both the requests immediately. This created in me the apprehension that all the fruits of my labor were being awarded to me now, and I would suffer in the hereafter. Hence I stopped expressing my desires before Allah."